We are delighted to introduce our next session, Where Does Fiction Come From? And hopefully have an answer by the end of it. Where does fiction come from? What is the process of its creation? How do you make up characters and situations that are believable? And why should the reader even care? Some of the world's acclaimed novelists, Shehan Karunatilaka, Deepti Kapoor, Ruth Ozeki, and Amit Chaudhary share their insights on the art of creating a novel with Alexandra Pringle. Our first speaker today, who I hope is already here, not yet, but she'll be here soon, Deepti Kapoor is the author of two novels, Age of Vice and A Bad Character. Age of Vice, forthcoming from Riverhead this month, is currently being translated into 20 languages and is in development for a TV series with FX Disney. We would like for you to give her a round of applause, and when she's here, she'll be on stage. Thank you. Our second speaker is Ruth Ozeki, a novelist, filmmaker, and Zen Buddhist priest. She's the author of 4 novels, and her work, The Book of Form and Emptiness, won the 2022 Women's Prize for Fiction. May we please have you on stage, ma'am? Oh, Deepti's here as well. Perfect. Second seat. Deepti first seat right there. Yep. Our third speaker today is Mr. Amit Chaudhary. Amit Chaudhary is the author of 8 novels, the latest of which is Sojourn. He's also a poet, essayist, short story writer, and musician. His works of non-fiction include Finding the Raga, which received the James Tate Black Prize this year. Other awards his work has received include the Commonwealth Writers' Prize, the Los Angeles Times Book Prize, and many others. He's a fellow of the Royal Society of Literature and an honorary fellow of the Modern Language Association of America and of Balliol College, Oxford. Our fourth speaker today is Shehan Karunatilaka, who is the author of 7 Moons of Mali Almeida, which won the Booker Prize of 2022. He's also authored the Commonwealth Prize-winning Chinaman, The Legend of Pradeep Matthew, and a short story collection titled The Birth Lottery. He's also published several children's books. Our moderator today is Alexandra Pringle, who is the editor-in-chief of Bloomsbury for 20 years. She's been awarded honorary degrees of Doctor of Letters from Anglia Ruskin and Warwick Universities. Ladies and gentlemen, where does fiction come from? Deepti Kapoor, Ruth Ozeki, Amit Chaudhary, and Shehan Karunatilaka in conversation with Alexandra Pringle. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and welcome everybody. Where indeed does fiction come from? That is a very mysterious thing, and if we are going to get anywhere near the answer, we better get going. But before we do, I'd love it if any of you in the audience are writing fiction to put your hands up so we can see. Yeah, I thought so. Great. So you all want to know. Before we start talking about the process of writing, I think we should talk about why we read fiction, because I think that is a really interesting thing. And I'd like to start with you, Shehan. Why do you think?
Why do we read fiction?
Why do we read it?
Not why we write it.
Yeah.
Okay, let's start there. The only plausible explanation I've heard is that you live inside your own head, and assuming this is the only life you get, the only person knowable to yourself is yourself, no matter how close you are to your spouse or your friends or so on. And fiction, I mean, I find it allows you to get in different heads. It's to see the world from, and to get out of your own head, which is also a blessing most times, and to see the world from someone else's eyes, that someone could be on the other side of the planet, could have lived hundreds of years ago. And I think getting out of your own head and getting into someone else's head, that's why I read fiction, and I think that's a blessing, and I think that's a great thing it can do. Yeah.
And of course, we start reading fiction when we're very young. It's the first thing we do as children, is read fiction, and you enter other worlds, don't you? Amit, what about you?
It's a good question. My tutor at UCL, where I was doing my first degree in English, was a novelist called Dan Jacobson, South African novelist. His question to me was, so he was my tutor in my 3rd year, why don't you read fiction? you know, because I read much more poetry than I did fiction. I'm trying to think. I mean, I grew up also reading much more poetry than I did fiction. I mean, of course, I did read stories. I was drawn to the kind of idea of something of narrative, or if that's one way of describing a poem, that it starts somewhere and ends somewhere, is a transformative kind of experience rather than an experience of, you know, accumulated information. You're finding out more and more about a story. So even if you don't find out very much, as you don't do in a poem, you don't necessarily learn more by the time you've ended a poem. You are transformed in some way by it. And the transformation is difficult to pin down in terms of information or movement, but there is a change. And it's a kind of change which, unlike fiction, I mean, you can return to immediately. You can reread the poem after you finish reading it. It's not exhausted by you having read it. So I was deeply drawn to the poetic, to poetry for these reasons. Now, when he said, you haven't read enough fiction, it's because I had said to him, you know, basically I have a subterranean agenda. I want to keep on being a student, a graduate student, because I want to keep writing. You know, and that was there were no creative writing scholarships then. I was studying literature. So I said, is it possible to get a first? He said, it is possible, but you haven't read enough fiction. And he gave me books to read. One of them was Sons and Lovers by Lawrence.
And of course, you've written about Lawrence.
Yes, I have. I hate talking about books that change your life, but it did change me as a writer, because there I encountered a kind of writing that could be a tribute to the world. And I hadn't realized, I mean, being a teenager, I thought that we must bewail existence with our writing. Otherwise, it's not important enough what we are doing. The fact that you could pay tribute through writing, and through the novel even. It's possible to do it through song and poem, but through the novel. That Sons and Lovers revealed to me. So that was a kind of moment where that reading maybe changed me, took me towards the direction of the novel as a writer.
Yes. And Ruth?
It's a wonderful question, and I hadn't thought about it deeply until this moment. I think when I was growing up, and I was an only child, and I didn't have anyone to talk to, and so I think I turned to fiction because it was a way of engaging in a conversation with another mind, with another imagination, with another set of experiences. And I would add to Shehan's comment that it was not just a way of getting into the mind of another person, but it was a way of inhabiting their body and their, you know, and living inside their skin for a while. And of course, we know that's very important. So to me, I think it was a way of expanding my own, at that time, of course, I was a child, very limited subjectivity, and trying to, you know, find a bigger persona to inhabit, or perhaps alternate personas to inhabit. And I think that's probably why I was drawn to it.
Deepti?
Well, first, as just a young reader, it was just to experience joy and grief and all these emotions that sometimes you don't experience when you're young, chaos, confusion, and as Ruth and Sneha said, to able to inhabit the mind and the consciousness of another character is so important to create that empathy, which then you can take when you start writing novels. So this happened to me last week. I was reading something in the bath, and sometimes you have this like moment where something just clicks, and then there was a writer with this incredible voice, very unique style, and he solved a problem I'd been wrestling with. And now that will live in my own work without anyone else knowing. So I think there's this kind of underground river through time between writers as well. So
Can you tell us what the problem was?
No, that's a secret. But yeah, it was structural. That's all.
Was it? Yeah. So tell me, when did you know you wanted to be a novelist?
Again, it was when I had moved away from Delhi, I was a journalist for years and moved to Goa, and I lived an extremely reduced life, very simple, and just read all the time. I had a little dial-up connection, so the internet was restricted to about 30 minutes a day. I mean, it seems like a different world, but that was it. And there was a bookshop that I would go to and just read everything. And there was also a way for me to suddenly realize that there are writers out there, and you're not. Growing up, you were exposed to Dickens. We had a kind of post-colonial education, and then later on, when I discovered the voices and the writers I liked, that's when I realized I can attempt this too. So it was really important.
That's an extraordinary moment. I remember when I was a teenager and reading the works of contemporary women writers like Margaret Drabble and Nell Dunn, and thinking, oh, women can write, and women can write about their own, in a sense, ordinary experience. And that's those moments are transformatory, aren't they? And you realize that the world is there for you. Yeah. Ruth, when did you know you wanted to be a novelist?
I think I realized when I read a book called Charlotte's Web, and
Yes.
we think that book is about a pig and a spider, but it's not. It's about a writer. Charlotte was a writer, and it was a book about the power of language and the power of words to save lives, and that seemed to me a tremendously wonderful thing. So I think it was probably.
How old were you?
Oh my gosh, I must have been very little. I'd say 5, 6 when I started, reading.
And when did you write how old were you when you wrote your first novel?
Okay, so I'm very slow. I didn't write my first novel until I was 40, but I had a career before that as a filmmaker. I got a little bit distracted and sort of went off on the film side of things. But by the time I was 40, I think I'd published my first novel.
And Amit, did you write poetry first before you wrote fiction?
I did. I wrote poetry, and all my apprenticeship was as a poet. That is, I was imitating writers I liked in that period. I also wanted to I considered being a filmmaker at one point. Yeah,
It seems to me you do everything, because there's music in your life too, isn't there?
There is, yeah. But to respond to the question you put, Deepti, earlier, I don't think I ever, within quotes, wanted to be a novelist, and I'm not sure even now that I want to be one. It's a form I'm drawn to, but also repelled by. I mean, the realist novel is not a form that I like. I find it difficult to read, and I don't write it. But there are certain things in it, like he said and she said. There's certain characteristics of the novel which I use. But I can't say that I want to be a novelist. I mean, this is a truthful answer. I've never been entirely happy with that.
Shehan, and of course you started with children's books.
No, children's books came much later. When I was stuck with the novel, I turned to children's books. No, but I guess I wanted to become a novelist when all the other options had dried up. I wanted to be a cricketer when I was a teenager. I used to bowl left-arm Chinaman, surprise, surprise, and I'd also bowl a fair few wides and full tosses, and so that never worked out. And I wanted to be a musician, I found myself in my 30s where none of the bands had worked out because I didn't have a lot of talent and I never practiced. And this is the difference I feel. Like, I looked at all the other musicians who were better than me, and they were compelled to play their guitar every single day, whereas I'd only do it when I had a gig or a pressing need to do it. But I wrote every day. I wrote every day when I was a teenager, wrote about being a failed cricketer, I wrote about being a failed rock star, I wrote about that stuff, and I kept diaries, and I jotted down ideas. That would make a great book, someone should write it. And then I found myself with this premise of, which became Chinaman in the end. What if the greatest cricketer had played for Sri Lanka in 1985 and no one noticed him? And I waited for someone to write it because I would have liked to read it. And then I thought, well, I'll have a crack at it. But I think the difference was I'm compelled to write every day. If I don't even put down a sentence of something, I feel the day is wasted. And it feels more like a compulsion than, and I wish I was compelled to play guitar every day, but I'm not. And so I think, yeah, it's not some burning ambition. I mean, of course I read as a child, and yeah, Charlotte's Web, writing on spider webs. I mean, that's a proper skill. And yeah, one word. And so I guess I came from advertising, where the day job was to write short pieces. But yeah, I think it's the thing that you do every day that you become, and that's what happened to me.
I think that is really interesting, because I was talking to Abdulrazak Ghana yesterday, and he said that he started writing to make sense of the world he was in and the decision he'd made to leave Zanzibar and what had happened to his life, without even thinking he was writing a novel. It was just the need to write. So I'm very, very interested in that, because a lot of young people, when they want to write, they think that it's a career, and it's not a career. It's a compulsion. And I always say, if you don't have to do it, please don't do it. You know. So, Deepti, what about you? Do you write every day? Have you always done that?
Yeah, mostly, though, when I'm on holiday. I haven't taken a holiday in years, but yeah, I write every day. I make notes, you know, and then I never consult those notes, but the process of note making in itself is practice. So yeah, I write every day, but sometimes then when you're actually in the process of writing a novel, for me it's a complete immersion where I have to break away from the world and have a completely different structure and routine. I wake up really early, I work in the early morning hours when no one is awake, and then I just take long walks or hike or even meditate, and then try and see no one. And then after 2 weeks of that, except my husband, after 2 weeks of that, I need a break, and then I go out in the world. But that is that's a different world, a different process. Otherwise, it's note making and observing, and just speaking with people. Yeah.
And I think there's a novelist I work with called Barbara Trapido, and she didn't write until she was in her 40s. And it was really because a friend of hers said, I've had enough of you telling all these incredible stories. Now just get with it and sit down and write down, you know, all the stories that you've told us. So I think the thing of allowing yourself to think that you can be a novelist is a particular thing. I think it's a difficult thing. So Ruth, what's your writing practice?
Well, I tend, when I'm being a writer, I write every day. Right now, I'm being an author, and those two jobs are very, very different. The writer is at home in her pajamas, right, and the author is up on stages talking about writing, whereas the writer writes. And so when I'm being a writer, I have a very strict schedule. I wake up not strict exactly, but consistent. I wake up every day. It's the first thing I do. I write for several hours, take a break, walk. It's so boring. Why am I telling you this? Writing is kind of boring, but not from the inside. You know, it's not that interesting to talk about. But the author, I think, is sort of like the PR arm of the enterprise, right? The one who goes out there and talks about writing and makes it sound very glamorous. But actually, the truth of it is that it's not.
It's not a glamorous job, but it's a schizophrenic thing of going from this interior world and this isolation of writing to sitting on a platform and meeting thousands of people, and it's so odd that you have to split yourself in that way.
But it's lovely too. I mean, because there's nothing like the relationship between writers and readers. I think it's an incredible kind of co-creative collaboration that we're engaged in. We think of a novel as being a book, a singular object going out into the world, but that's not accurate at all. I mean, a novel is an array of experiences that we co-create, right? So every person who picks up my book will be co-creating a different book, right? And so that's a fantastic thing. It's alchemical.
It is a kind of alchemy, isn't it?
See, it's not glamorous, but you can work in your pajamas. And I know everyone now works in their pajamas, but we were doing it first before Zoom. And
you were really out there, weren't you, in the avant-garde of pajama wearing?
I prefer sarong myself.
Do
but
you?
yeah.
Yeah, well, you know, it's a bit more glamorous in this bit of the world, I'm afraid, than in where I come from. So I think it would be interesting to talk about what is the sort of kick-off point for a novel. I think, you know, some people it's an idea. Some novelists are very ideas-driven, and some people are very character-driven. Shehan, how are you driven?
So it does start with it starts with a subject, I guess. Someone should write a novel about Sri Lankan cricket when it was awful in the 80s, or someone should write a ghost story about Sri Lanka's victory. So it'll start with a subject, and then also I come from advertising background, so the log line is very key to starting a brief. You need this one sentence or two sentence premise, and so I do start with that, but I feel that's the easy part. Everyone's got an idea for a great movie, a great novel. For me, it doesn't exist until the voice appears, and the voice may not, and voice is not something you can contrive or manufacture. Whereas, I mean, who knows, the AI is getting better every day. I know they can manufacture log lines quite easily, but voice is something that you arrive at, and I think with both the novels, I've had several false starts where I start every novel in the third person, and the first one ended up in the first person, the second one in the second person. So I guess next one I can maybe stick to the third person, but it's until that voice arrives. So the first one was supposed to be a biography of this forgotten cricketer, but it's only until I realized that the drunk journalist in the corner who was in chapter 4 is going to be the voice of the book that the book really took off. And I think that's true for anything you write, even an article, even a travel article. There is a voice, even though maybe you're the traveler. You have a certain voice to it, and I find, I don't know, with deadlines and stuff, I will spend 2 weeks coming up with the first sentence, usually on the night before it's due, and then 2 hours later, 1,000 pages has written itself. But once you get the voice of the first paragraph, so I feel a project doesn't exist. It's an interesting idea, but until you find the tone of voice, it doesn't exist. Yeah.
Absolutely. Amit, what drives you? What's your kickoff?
It's a difficult question. I mean, as I said, I mean, to go back to when I began to write before I began writing my first novel, when I was still trying to be a poet because I wanted to be a poet. And I'm echoing Larkin here, because Larkin says, oh, I never wanted to be a poet. I wanted to be a novelist. I ended up being a poet, you know. So there's something askew as far as ambition and intention are concerned, as where these things are concerned. So I wanted to be a poet. I was passing through that apprentice period when I thought writing poetry, and remember at that time poetry was still the dominant literary genre. I'm talking even until the mid-80s. And I thought that a serious genre should have serious subjects, so there were, in my head, serious subjects. And I couldn't imagine that, you know, let's say, writing about the street my parents had moved to in Bombay, in Bandra, after my father had retired, could be a subject for a poem. Because I'd read The Wasteland, you know, and I knew poems should be about, you know, the fragmenting of civilization. So, you know, there was a point at which I wrote a poem about St. Cyril Road. And that kind of let go of a constraint, and I knew that something had happened, kind of semi-new. Similarly, when I began to write about my uncle, now when I say that, it's not reportage. You meet your uncle again, anew, as if they were someone you didn't know and you're becoming familiar with. When I knew I wanted to write about that world, I knew this wasn't proper literary subject matter. From the way I would have thought, let's say, 2 years or 1 year prior to starting out on this novel. It just seemed too banal, too ordinary. The fact that I was going there, again, freed something up, removed a constraint. I did not have to produce literature. I could work with something that was unfit for literature. each project is, again, a kind of confrontation of that moment of unfeasibility and absurdity. Is this a proper subject for a novel? And then you go towards it, and there is, again, that freedom from constraint that going towards it involves, I think. Yeah.
I think actually it would be quite interesting to touch on the subjects of genre, because you know, some of you here have sort of dipped into genre, where you're all very literary writers. And Ruth, you've won the Red Tentacle Award, haven't you? I remember Margaret Atwood winning it, and she made a red tentacle hat to go and get it.
That's right. That's right. Yes, it's for fantasy yes. Fiction, and I was very surprised because I was honored. I had never thought to write in genre, but the story just seemed to want to be, or at least elements of the story seem to want to go in that direction. I would never say never. I have never started with the idea of writing in a certain genre and then trying to do that. Rather, I will start writing and then try to allow the story to determine the direction it wants to travel in. And I think this was for A Tale for the Time Being, my previous novel, and that was a novel that was inspired by a Zen essay by a Zen master, 13th century Zen master named Dogen, and it was an essay about time, and it was called Time Being, and it's a very knotty, deep, philosophical text that I was struggling with. Certainly had nothing to do with fantasy or science fiction, but again, as Shehan said, what came to me was a voice. As I was reading this text and trying to understand it, suddenly the voice of this young girl started speaking to me, and she introduced herself and she said, "Hi, my name is Now, and I'm a time being. Do you know what a time being is? Well, if you give me a moment, I will tell you." And then the story kind of took off from there. And I had no idea when I started it that it was going to go into these fantastical places. But I was very happy when it did. And I'm always very happy when a story does something that I'm not expecting it to, because it makes it so much more interesting that way.
That's absolutely wonderful. So, and Deepti, I was doing a little bit of, thinking about this session beforehand, and I saw in The Guardian there was a review of your novel, and it says, and I think this is really interesting, certainly does not disappoint as a commercial crime thriller, but it deserves literary plaudits as well for its depth and relevance, and for proving once more that the novel remains the supreme medium of long-form narrative drama for us to binge upon. I thought that was absolutely wonderful. So tell us a little bit about, for you, the balance between those things.
Yeah, this is a really interesting question, and I've been thinking about it a lot, because my own process is, I think of voice and character, and I think, when the voices in my head become too cacophonious, that's when they need an outlet, and I write. But, there's also the demands of the publishing industry, and when you're working as an author, even after maybe you do one book and it gets a few reviews, but then you've got, not that great sales, and then I had a couple of novels that were rejected, manuscripts now lying in a drawer somewhere, but I knew I needed to do something different when I was writing Age of Vice. I knew, and I thought, okay, what if I start with a car crash, and what if the wrong person goes to, is blamed, and then what if there's this and this, and it suddenly started to take another form of what you might call a thriller. And it was certainly not my intention. I don't read genre thrillers and crime thrillers, but it's interesting because when you write, you don't think at all about genre, but then when the publishing industry and the marketing machine comes in, and then they're like, okay, this is what we can say, and then this is what we can compare it to, and it's kind of like a double-edged sword, because you have this very specific idea for your book, and then everyone else just comes and receives it their own way, and that's just how it goes. I think people like to read thrillers, so that's where the marketing machine wants to take you to. Yeah.
You make us sound like a terrible lot.
Well, not the editors. No. I mean, it's just, I can see why the book is being called a thriller as well.
Yeah,
so.
Absolutely. And Shehan, you've been described as writing a ghost story. Did you think of your writing as that?
Yeah, for sure. I guess I differ with the rest of the panel. I really like genre, and I think of myself as a genre writer. And the first one's a detective story. It's a missing person detective story. The second one's a murder mystery. And I read literary stuff, obviously, but I do like reading a good horror story and a good thriller. And I think it takes a great skill to craft that, and even though it may be dismissed as, there's formulas to everything, but within that formula, how you do it. And like with the first question, we were talking about the purpose of fiction and getting into other people's heads and bodies and minds, but also fiction is fun, and it's as an entertainment, and that's how I think most of us came to reading stuff that we enjoyed rather than stuff that'll make us better. So I tried, and I always set out to write a nice, tight 200-page detective story, and I end up rambling and digressing, and it gets put in the literary category because gets put up for prizes, which is not the intention. I've also been curious and I've asked this at LitFest, the difference between fantasy and magical realism. And because, fine, the book has ghosts and demons and talking animals. I don't know if there is an official definition. It feels like if you have a dragon in your book, if the dragon breathes fire, it's fantasy. If the dragon is a Marxist Trotsky, then it's magical realism. And I never really thought of that. But I'd be happy being in the fantasy section and getting HBO series made out of the thing. But instead... So I actually come from genre, and even the short stories, I always think, okay, I want to write a thriller, I want to write a love story, but it kind of goes all over the show, and I think people mistake the rambling for profundity, perhaps, but I'll take it, yeah.
I think I'm really interested in this thing of fantasy because I've just now left publishing, and after 40-something years working in publishing and thinking of myself as a literary editor, I realized that my most successful books I've ever published could all be described as fantasy. So Madeline Miller's Song of Achilles and Circe, Susanna Clarke's Piranesi, and Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, and then a very young Oxford student I took on called Samantha Shannon, and she's written this huge fantasy novel called Priory of the Orange Tree, and I think I completely done the wrong thing in my life. I should have been a genre editor all along. It's like, but isn't it all about just either as a publisher publishing what you love, and as a writer just doing what you love and then seeing what happens? Don't you think none of us know? And that's why you don't want to be too constrained by ideas of what works and what doesn't work. You just have to do what you do.
I think the instinct is always to write something that readers want to devour. There's always that impulse, I want to write something that people want to read and be entertained by, and then everything comes in after that.
Yes.
Let me just add something. I personally don't like what's called fantasy these days. I love detective fiction. I love Hitchcock. To go to cinema. What I like about Hitchcock, what I like about Ray's Satyajit Ray's children's movies, especially the detective movies, Joy Baba Felunath and Shonar Kella, is unfettered observation of the everyday. In this kind of context of tension, but new vistas on things we don't notice, the detective gives him a narrative excuse to notice those things or be inquiring into those things, but the artist wants to notice them anyway. You know, so I do like that aspect of what happens in detective fiction, in the best detective fiction, or a certain kind of cinema or children's cinema. And I love the way that generation, and say in the Bengali language, moved towards those domains without any kind of self-consciousness about genre. You know, for me, what I see as genre now is still a kind of a realist construct, in the sense that it's still speaking in the syntax of realism. This happened, and then that happened, and then that happened. Now, in a realist novel, the man got up, and then he was killed, and then whatever, something else happened after that. In fantasy, the man got up, somebody flew in from the way, a flying elephant, or whatever. But the grammar of realism is being preserved. And I want that broken up. Whether it's, and fantasy doesn't break it up necessarily. One has to kind of think of other ways. Fantasy sticks to that grammar. And it depends on whether you find it oppressive or not. I personally find it oppressive, not fantasy, the grammar of realism, where you have to have one thing after another. Whether it's realism or magic realism or fantasy, a lot of the punctuation of realism is all there, is all intact. And I think many of us, or at least some of us, want to break out of that.
Okay. So we must, I hope you all have some questions, but I just want to touch on something which I think is very important, in that we are at a very particular cultural moment. And I want us to talk a little bit about imagination. And nowadays, what you feel as writers you are allowed to do or not allowed to do, because as we all know, we are in what's sort of loosely called the culture wars. And, I don't know if any of you heard Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie's Wreath lecture, which I think was a very important lecture in lots of ways, because she feels very strongly that writers are being over-constrained, and that it is the death of art and the death of imagination. And I just wanted very briefly for each of you to say if you feel that at all, and what your views are. Shehan, would you kick off?
Well, this is the wearing other people's hats question, no? And
yes, whether you can write outside your own cultural experience.
Well, the thing is, I suppose both my books fall into lived cultural experience, but the narrators are selected quite carefully to be very different to me. So the first one was a man twice my age, much from a different generation, much more conservative, and then we have this activist who's, I guess, closer to my age, but again, very different politically and so on. But I'm still sticking within my lane. And I do have a lot of questions being asked about having a gay protagonist, and are you allowed as a cisgender, heteronormative dude to even enter this territory? And I would like, and when I look at Sri Lanka's war and the lack of stories coming out of it, there's a few stories coming out, but I just think not enough for something that concluded almost 15 years ago. I'm interested to hear the Tamil perspective and the Tamil female perspective, and we've had a few, ex-Tiger gunmen and gunwomen writing about that. But if we don't have many more, I would like to attempt one, and would I be able to, as a Sinhala Buddhist man, to write from that perspective? I think you shouldn't be placing visas on where your imagination can go, where there's enough visas and border controls in the real world. But I think you should tread carefully in that if you get it wrong, or if you are patronizing, or if you resort to stereotypes, and then you deserve all the flack that you're going to get. So you do it with empathy and respect and do your research, and I don't see any reason why you can't travel into different heads and inhabit different minds. Yeah.
Thank you. Ruth, would you like to say?
I don't really know what I could add to that. I agree with it completely. I've chosen, I made a decision early on to always have mixed race protagonists in my books. I mean, and for various reasons, plot reasons, symbolic reasons, metaphorical reasons, the structural reasons as well, the way that I'm structuring my books, it made sense to do that for me. At the same time, I really admire writers like, for example, Hanya Yanagihara, who is a Japanese-American writer who writes completely outside of her cultural and sexual identity, right? And so, I think that the choice really, for me, is a personal one, and it's also an artistic one. It's one that I've chosen because it serves my literary purpose. And when it stops doing that, then I will change. And I don't know what that's going to feel like yet. I don't think I'm ready to do what, or I'm interested in doing what Hanya has done, but at some point I might be. And at that point I will, and keep my fingers crossed. Yeah.
We'll keep them crossed for you. Questions? Would you like to put your arms up? Okay, there's a woman in the second row with the yellow top.
Thank you for the wonderful session. Throughout the scene, when we are talking.
Can you just hold the mic a little closer?
Yeah, can you hear me? Okay. So I had a question, and it may sound very silly, but are authors introvert or extrovert to write fiction?
Introvert or extrovert?
Yes.
Who would like to answer that? Deepti.
Introvert. Well, I mean, I'm speaking for myself, but I think a lot of writers are introverts because it's this idea that you can't express or communicate yourself with other people, and then it comes out in your writing. But then you're a performer, like right now as well. So it's kind of like a dual identity. Yeah.
I agree. I think it's a dual identity. I find more and more that when I'm actually writing, I'm also, I'm very introverted when I'm writing, but I am performing on the page and I'm inhabiting the characters, and some of my characters are extremely extroverted. And so, this kind of extrovert side persona will come out then, but it's all done within the privacy of my own office, usually wearing pajamas, right?
I think we should start up a new fashion line called Author's Pajamas and Sarongs. Okay, we need to keep moving so that people... There's somebody with a striped shirt who is jumping up and down. No, it's you with glasses, yeah.
Thank you, very insightful conversation. My question is, Kojo Ishiguro once said that being a novelist, what happens is that you realize what you are deeply interested in and what you are superficially interested in. So has that ever happened with you, that you give up on project because you are grabbed by another enticing idea? Or is it something that just writers should avoid and keep focusing on the ongoing project? Thank you.
Amit, would you like to say something?
I'm always happy to be distracted and move towards other things if I stay with... This kind of connects with the question you asked about my writing practices, or everybody's. I find it useful to move towards other things. It's the same... I mean, Shehan rightly said that constant practice makes a musician. But even with music, I mean, especially with the voice, there are times when you might overwork the voice. You get... Physically, the voice is a muscle that might get jaded. Mentally, you might get jaded as a singer as well. And the same is true, I think, of writing, at least for me. Maybe because I don't write... I think with writing a realist novel, you must maybe write every day. But otherwise, if you're working in a different way, then there need to be distractions in order to refresh that muscle. So I'm happy to be distracted.
Do you want to say something quickly? We've got so little time. Perhaps we should move.
I got distracted. What happened?
He's distracted, you see, already. There's a man in the third row with a beard. Yeah.
I come from a background of 30 years in journalism. And in the last 5 years, I'm trying to transit from fact to fiction. You started this show by asking why fiction? And I believe that we write fiction when we are insecure about sharing our own truths. Would you like to react to that?
When we're insecure about sharing...
Sharing our own truths. We'd rather write facts, but we transit to fiction. We take the tool of fiction to write essentially our own truths that we face. And the truths could be sad, they could be happy, whichever way it is.
No, I think that is the luxury of being a fiction writer, why we choose it. The ability to hide behind masks, or hide behind different narrators, and maybe let them voice things that you're not brave enough, or maybe take a position that you may not quite agree with. I think that's, and that's why, I mean, I've tried my hand at journalism, but it's much more fun to make the stuff up and have the characters, and yeah, you don't control the characters, they control themselves, but to, you know, I like being a bass player because you have something to hide behind, and no one actually is looking at you. Back to the introvert question, I've never had the need to be a lead guitarist or singer. I'm happy being a bass player. I'd be happy being a drummer. And if the bass player is bad, you don't blame the bass player. You just think there's something wrong with the band, and that's kind of where. But yeah, the hiding behind different faces is I think the luxury of being a fiction writer. And you
must be a good musician if you're a bass player. I mean, you get to the root of all the harmonies and chords.
I'd like to think so. But it's genius until I pick up the instrument, and that's when. But yeah, sorry, I forgot the question that I got distracted from about. Do you abandon things and so on? I think you've got to pick a topic that you're going, because these things take so long. Am I going to be interested enough to do this for 3 years? And we talked in another panel, a bad book takes as long to write as a decent book. Am I going to spend 2 years on this draft? Am I interested enough in this subject? I think that's the first question you ask yourself. The second question is, can I make it play? And sometimes you try and you can't make it play. But if you're interested enough, you will persevere. And then hopefully a reader will be just as interested. Yeah.
Ruth, you were going to say something.
Well, and just in response to this question about truth, first of all, I think that, I agree that when we write fiction, we hide behind this fiction of fiction, right? And that's to keep us safe, because I think that fiction, in a way, is the most intimate type of writing that I can imagine. But the other thing is that truth is a very complicated thing, and the kind of truth that you can get at through journalism is going to be very different than the kind of truth that you can touch through fiction writing, because it exists in multiple planes. It's not just rational and intellectual truths, it's also emotional truths and physical truths, embodied truths. It's a huge, it's a huge thing that we're trying to evoke somehow in fiction. And I think that's what makes it so powerful. It's also collaborative. Once again, the truth becomes a collaboration, right, between the reader and the writer.
Thank you. We have time for, I think, one more question. There is a man in a blue shirt and a hat.
Yes, please. Let us have a singular, embodied Tamil perspective. How hard can it be? If it's impossible, then the future of Sri Lanka is impossible. It must be possible. All great literature is a car crash of genres. I want to ask the panel, do they appreciate that it is in the convenient inconvenience of car crashes of genres that your creativity really comes to question what realism means, what different kinds of realism there are?
Deepti, would you like to?
You wrote about car crashes.
I'm not sure what the question is, but I think I don't know. I mean, all great literature does come from attempting to write something that then becomes genre. I mean, it doesn't start off with you thinking you're. I'm sorry, Shehan, I'm contradicting you here because you said you're right. I think just it's difficult to think of genre when you start writing. I think it's just important to listen to the voices in your head. And for me, literature just comes from memory, subconscious impulses, conscious self-reflection, and environmental observation. 4 things.
Thank you. Now, we are out of time, and I'm sorry we couldn't have more questions. There's obviously a lot that you want to ask, but I just want to say thank you so much to this panel. We have here 4 extraordinary writers, 4 great imaginations who've shared something of themselves with all of us today. So thank you very much.
We would like to thank Deepti Kapoor, Ruth Ozeki, Amit Chaudhary, and Shehan Karunatilaka and Alexandra Pringle for their insights. What's not fiction is that all 4 of them will be available at the book signing stall to my right. And if you also like telling stories like them, global entertainment platform Pocket FM has a wonderful opportunity for you. They have a stall right behind the front lawn, and they have a community of over 80 million listeners and content creators across the globe. And if you do want a life-changing opportunity to be part of the Writers Program and win exciting prizes, do not forget to visit their stall behind the front lawn. Thank you, and please do help us keep the festival clean with the waste bins placed across the festival. And please also do not get food and beverages inside the venue. If you have any beverages, please finish them outside and only then enter the venue. Thank you. And don't forget, we have the last day of the Jaipur Music Stage tonight. There's Shadow and Light and Kabir Cafe gracing the stage. If you want to still buy your tickets, they're available at jaipurmusicstage.com, as well as the information counter right outside the entry. Thank you. Have a great day ahead, and we will see you at the next session at the front lawn.